Captain Voss was told this was a communications hardening drill. The man walking beside her had never once touched his radio. Captain Elena Voss had run communications hardening drills before, but never one where the attached liaison carried no radio. Marshal Dade walked the tree line like the cold didn't reach him, a leather notebook tucked against his chest, offering nothing when Voss asked what exactly the Pentagon wanted tested. Her team, Calloway, Reyes, Bract, Coulson, moved through the frozen lodgepole pine of the Bitterroot Selway wilderness with the practiced rhythm of a unit that trusted its orders more than the men delivering them. The insertion had gone smoothly, which in Voss's experience was usually the first warning sign, not the last. The helicopter had dropped them 8 kilometers from Ridge 7 in near total silence. No moon, wind chill well past 30 below. Calloway walked point security behind Coulson, muttering just loud enough for Voss to hear that a civilian liaison had no business humping a wilderness route with an ODA team, drill or not. Nobody argued the point. Nobody had an answer for it either. Bract kept close to the middle of the formation, checking his rig's battery indicator every few hundred meters out of nervous habit rather than necessity. Reyes walked beside him without being asked, the way medics learn to orbit the team member most likely to need them first. The forest thickened as they climbed, snow-laden branches closing overhead until the world narrowed to headlamp beams and breath. Somewhere behind them, Dade's footsteps stayed exactly, unervingly, in step with the squad's pace. They reached Ridge 7:40 minutes ahead of schedule. Bract had the relay assembled and transmitting within 20 minutes, antenna mast locked, signal strength nominal, the whole exercise reading as routine as advertised. Voss allowed herself the smallest exhale of the night, watching Calloway run a final perimeter sweep while Coulson settled into an overwatch position on the rocks above the clearing. For nearly 6 minutes, Operation Fallow Ground looked exactly like the hardware test it was supposed to be. Then, without warning, every channel on the encrypted band dissolved into a low, rhythmic static that pulsed in a pattern too regular to be interference. Calloway noticed it first. A beat, almost a heartbeat, buried inside the noise, repeating at intervals too precise for atmospheric distortion. Bract cycled through frequencies trying to shake it loose and found the same pulse waiting on every channel he touched, as though something on the other end were listening rather than jamming. Coulson called it in from the flank. Seismic sensors staked along the perimeter were registering repeated four-legged movement, heavy, deliberate, circling rather than approaching, at a radius too wide to visually confirm. Reyes checked the thermal scope slave to the same feed and reported nothing. No heat signature anywhere within 400 meters, not even residual warmth in the snow where the sensors insisted something had recently stood. The contradiction sat wrong with everyone except Dade, who kept his eyes on the tree line like a man waiting for a scheduled event. Voss ordered the team to hold position and verify equipment, refusing to accept a sensor contradiction as anything but a hardware fault this early into the exercise. Calloway ran diagnostics on the seismic array twice, found nothing wrong with either system, and reported back with the flat, careful tone of a man who didn't like his own conclusion. Bract's static held its rhythm the entire time, patient, unbothered by their troubleshooting, as if it were waiting them out rather than malfunctioning. Dade's reaction to all of it was wrong, not startled, attentive, like a man confirming a hypothesis rather than encountering a surprise. His pen moving briefly against the notebook before he caught himself and stopped. Voss filed it away, the way she filed away every small thing that didn't add up about a man she hadn't chosen for this mission and couldn't remove from it. When the static finally resolved, for 3 full seconds, into something that sounded unmistakably like breathing, Dade was the only person on the ridge who didn't flinch. Voss made the call before she'd finished forming the reasoning behind it. Strike the relay, fall back toward the extraction rally point 6 full hours ahead of schedule. Treat the contradiction as a live threat rather than a training inconvenience. Bract broke the antenna down with hands that had started shaking despite the cold having nothing to do with it. Calloway didn't argue the early withdrawal for once, which told Voss more about how the ridge felt than anything the sensors had shown them. The forest didn't cooperate with retreat. The static followed them for the first 200 meters of the withdrawal, fading only once the relay equipment was fully powered down, which made no sense to Bracht and made Voss's skin crawl for reasons she couldn't yet justify to herself. Coulson moved 15 meters ahead on point, weapon low, reading the treeline the way he read everything, without comment, without wasted motion, and without the visible unease the rest of the team was starting to carry openly. 20 minutes into the withdrawal, Coulson went still and raised a closed fist. The team stopped as one, weapons coming up in near-silent unison, breath held against the cold. Ahead, in a shallow draw choked with drifted snow, 5 sets of paired amber eyes ignited in the dark almost simultaneously, low to the ground, spaced with unnatural evenness. Not the scattered glow of animals startled into alertness, but the deliberate, synchronized activation of something that had been waiting for the exact moment the team changed direction. Rhea's voice cracked over the internal net before discipline caught up with her fear. Pack formation, minimum 5, movement pattern consistent with coordinated flanking rather than a hunting pursuit. Calloway swung his weapon toward the nearest set of eyes and found, for the first time in 11 years of service, that his hands were shaking hard enough to blur the sight picture. Behind them all, Dade had already opened his notebook, pen moving steadily, as though the night had finally arrived at the page he'd been waiting to fill in. The pack didn't charge. That was the detail that unraveled Voss's understanding of the night faster than the eyes ever could. 5 amber gazes held position at the treeline, pulsing in a rapid, erratic rhythm, while the team backed toward a frozen creek bed that offered the only defensible choke point within reach. The stillness stretched long enough that Calloway lowered his weapon a fraction, unconsciously, before catching himself and raising it again. Only when Coulson fired a single warning round into the snow did the pack finally move. Not toward the team, but into a wide, patient arc that mirrored the exact contour of their retreat path, as if it had been rehearsed on this exact terrain before. Voss watched the arc close with a cold, specific dread that had nothing to do with claws or teeth. Animals reacted to gunfire. This had adjusted to it the way a unit adjusts to contact. It was Bracht who broke first under the strain of holding the relay equipment while his hands refused to stop shaking, stumbling on a root buried under the snow and losing half a step of formation spacing. It was Bracht the pack targeted for it, a single wolf breaking from the arc to test the edge of the formation exactly where the youngest, least steady member stood exposed. Reyes was between them in under 2 seconds flat, aid bag already open, weapon forgotten in favor of a body block that put her own back to the treeline. The creature's claws raked empty air where Bracht's shoulder had been a heartbeat earlier, close enough that Reyes felt the displaced cold of it against her cheek. The pack retreated the instant contact failed, sliding back into the arc without a single wasted motion, without the frenzy Voss expected from a failed strike. Not fear, she realized, watching them regroup with mechanical precision. Discipline. Something out here had been taught restraint, and taught it recently enough to still practice it under fire. Dade finally spoke, and what came out of his mouth had nothing to do with a communications drill. He identified himself flatly as Unit 0, a designation none of them had clearance to recognize, delivered with the same even tone he'd used for small talk on the helicopter ride in. The exercise, he said, had been constructed specifically to lure a single specimen back into a containment radius after a breach 11 months prior. The pack was incidental. The team's real objective, hidden from every one of them except him, had been to draw out the alpha. Voss's fury was immediate and controlled, the kind that came from a decade of swallowing anger she couldn't act on in the field. She had 6 people, one of them wounded in confidence if not yet in body, walking a black-budget recovery operation they'd been told was routine hardware testing, on terrain someone above her pay grade had chosen specifically because it worked. Calloway wanted Dade's sidearm and his notebook in the snow, and said so, loudly enough that Reyes had to physically step between them. Coulson said nothing at all through any of it, which frightened Voss more than anything Dade had admitted, because Coulson only went silent when he'd already decided something the rest of them hadn't caught up to yet. Bracht, still shaking, asked the only question that mattered to him. Whether the specimen Dade wanted recovered was the reason the relay had picked up something that sounded like breathing. Dade didn't answer that one directly, and the silence that followed told Voss everything the notebook hadn't. There was no time left to argue the ethics of it. The wind had shifted, carrying the pack's low, layered growling back toward the creek bed in waves that rose and fell with unnatural coordination. 5 distinct voices settling into something closer to a rhythm than a chorus of aggression. Reyes kept one hand on Brack's arm, steadying him, while quietly running triage math in her head for a casualty count that hadn't happened yet but felt, to her, inevitable within the hour. That was when the amber eyes at the treeline shifted, one pair rising noticeably higher and burning with a slower, steadier pulse than the rest, easily half a meter above where the pack's eyes had settled only moments before. The alpha had arrived without a sound, without disturbing a single branch, snow undisturbed beneath a frame that size should never have allowed to move that quietly. It studied the 6-person formation with an attention that felt less like a predator sizing up prey and more like something reading a report it had already seen the ending of. Voss ordered the fallback to the creek bed choke point, and for a moment discipline reasserted itself over panic. Calloway anchoring the rear, Coulson covering the flank from a fallen log, Reyes keeping Brack upright and moving through snow that had started falling harder, thick enough now to blur the treeline into a gray wall. Dade, to everyone's visible disgust, moved with practiced calm rather than fear, watching the alpha the way a handler watches an animal it has trained rather than one it has merely studied from a distance. Voss filed that observation too, certain now that whatever Unit 0 had done to this creature went far beyond simple containment protocol. She had 6 minutes, maybe less, before the choke point stopped being a defensible position and started being a dead end with a frozen creek at their backs. Brack's radio, still transmitting on the open channel out of habit, caught the low static rhythm one final time. 3 pulses evenly spaced and then silence as though something had confirmed a signal and shut it down deliberately. The alpha closed the distance in a controlled, unhurried stride that ate the terrain twice as fast as its size should have allowed, its slower amber pulse never breaking rhythm even as the pack fanned wide around the team's position to seal off the far bank of the creek. Calloway opened fire the moment it crossed the 60-meter mark. 3 controlled bursts placed exactly where a decade of training told him center mass should be, and watched every round land without visibly slowing the creature at all. For one impossible instant the alpha shifted its weight in a motion that read, unmistakably, as a combat sidestep, the kind drilled into infantry through years of repetition, not evolved in an animal born to run in a straight line. Reyes screamed the observation aloud before she could stop herself. It was reading their spacing, adjusting to their formation the way a trained operator would, not the way a wolf circles a wounded herd looking for the weakest angle of approach. Dade's notebook came out again, and this time Voss saw what was written inside as he flipped it toward her without being asked. Rows of dates, coordinates, and a single recurring designation stamped beside each one in block letters. Sextant. Not a creature's name. A call sign, the kind assigned to a person, not catalogued for a specimen. Voss had half a second to understand what that meant before the pack surged in from both flanks, forcing Coulson to abandon his log and fall back toward the group under fire from angles he couldn't cover alone. The decision that followed took less than 3 seconds and felt, to Voss, like it took an hour. Brack could barely stand under the weight of the relay pack, slowing the group's retreat across the creek ice by critical seconds they didn't have. Dropping the equipment meant losing their only working comms link the moment they needed extraction most. Voss made the call to cut him loose from the pack rather than the team, snapping the straps herself while Reyes laid down covering fire, refusing to leave either the equipment or the man behind. The pack pressed the gap the instant it opened, 2 wolves breaking from the flank toward the exposed position Coulson had just vacated, amber eyes strobing faster now, erratic, almost frantic compared to the alpha's unbroken rhythm behind them. Calloway pivoted and put both down in quick succession, the reports flat and swallowed by the falling snow, buying the 15 seconds Voss needed to get Brack moving again with the relay slung instead of carried, weight redistributed, formation barely holding. The alpha broke into a final charge as Calloway's suppressed rounds found its shoulder without meaningfully slowing it. closing the last stretch of open ground in a single extended stride that put it almost within reach of the group. Coulson made the shot that mattered, center mass, point blank, timed to the half-second window the creature's stride left open, and drove it back into the snow at last, breath tearing out of it in a low, ragged sound that was almost unbearably close to a groan of pain rather than a growl. The pack scattered into the tree-line the instant their alpha went down, discipline evaporating into something closer to grief, voices rising into a broken, uneven howl that none of them could listen to for long without feeling it in their chest. Dade moved forward before Voss could stop him, kneeling in the blood-dark snow beside the fallen alpha, and pressed 2 fingers to the base of its throat, exactly where a man checks another man's pulse rather than an animal's. He said nothing about what he found there, and his face gave away even less. When the extraction helicopter finally cut through the tree-line 40 minutes later, the alpha's body was gone, along with Dade, and the only thing left behind in the snow was a single military-issue dog tag, half melted into the ice near the spot where he'd knelt. A name was stamped into it that none of them recognized, along with a service date that placed its owner as missing in action 19 years before Voss was ever assigned to Special Forces. Long enough ago that whatever Sextant had once been, it had stopped being anyone's rescue mission decades before it became theirs. The Bitterroot recovery team was debriefed separately and reassigned within the month. Voss to a training billet in Georgia, Calloway transferred out of Special Forces entirely, Reyes and Bracht never posted to the same unit again. The dog tag was never returned to them, and no official record of Operation Fallow Ground exists in any declassified index. What remains is a single line buried in a Unit 0 asset file. Sextant, recovery status pending, handler contact terminated. Subscribe to the world behind midnight to uncover the next operation before it disappears. Because some secrets are best left behind midnight.